Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to look at the 15 studio albums released by Aussie hard rock legends AC/DC. They formed in Australia in 1973 when brothers Macolm and Angus Young got together with bass player Mark Evans, drummer Phil Rudd, and singer Bon Scott. They made 5 international albums together before Bon Scott died in a car outside a house just up the road from here. And he was replaced by Brian Johnson, but far from being the death knell for the band, with Brian Johnson they went from strength to strength, becoming one of the biggest multi-million selling bands on the planet. We've got a lot to get through, so let's get straight into it. At number 15 from 1985, Fly on the Wall. Oh, this is not a great record. Simon Wright is in on drums at this stage. Phil Rudd has been fired. And Simon Wright's drums have that horrible 80s reverberation wash over everything. There's barely any bass on this album. It's mixed very, very low. And Brian Johnson sounds very shrill. The songs have no body to them at all, and they're not great songs. The single Shake Your Foundations is almost unlistenable. I mean, sometimes a band just drops the ball, and like so many classic rock acts in the 80s, AC/DC were finding their way sonically, and this really does deserve its place at the bottom of the list, I think. Number 14 from 2014, Rock or Bust. This came quite shortly after Black Ice. It was 6 years, but that was quite short for AC/DC by this stage. Malcolm Young had died from dementia by this point, and he was a key songwriter, so the songs on this album I think are not great. His place had been taken by his nephew Stevie Young. I'd be hard pressed to sing the riff or the chorus of the single Play Ball. I'm not sure I could. And the supporting cast of songs is equally bland. It's the shortest AC/DC album, mercifully. I mean, it sounds good. It sounds all right. It sounds like AC/DC are back, but really there's no body or meat on these songs at all. Number 13, Blow Up Your Video from 1988. Again, this has got Simon Wright on drums, and it has that 80s drum sound that the band were using at the time, which I just don't think has its place in the AC/DC sound. There are some good songs on here. There's Heat Seeker, Blow Up Your Video, That's the Way I Want to Rock and Roll. But again, if the sound of the record is unappealing, then the whole thing kind of becomes unappealing, and Blow Up Your Video is very firmly in that category, I'm afraid. Number 12, The Razor's Edge from 1990. Chris Slade had come in. He'd played in The Firm with Jimmy Page, amongst other things. He'd come in by this point, and he's got a much better handle on a drum sound. So the drum sound is a little bit more compact. It's a little bit tighter. It's a little bit more AC/DC. There's some good songs here. Money Talks, Are You Ready, Thunderstruck. And there are signs, again, like so many other acts, classic acts at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, they're beginning to find their feet again, as are AC/DC here. So The Razor's Edge is a fairly solid entry into the AC/DC canon. Number 11, Black Ice from 2008. They had been away for 8 years before they released this, and this is interesting because those 8 years the band's stock had risen really, really considerably, because their music had been used in many films, particularly Iron Man, but also loads and loads of video games. So AC/DC really had been introduced to a whole new generation. So the expectations for this album were quite high. Brendan O'Brien is in producing, and he does a really good job. The sound is rich and it's powerful. It's got a kick. But it's also got a sort of modern sheen to it. There's a real dynamic in it. The songs are not bad. There's Rock and Roll Train was the big song, Anything Goes, Big Jack. So it was really nice to have them back. Even though the album wasn't spectacular, it was very listenable. Number 10, Flick of the Switch from 1983. They recorded this in Nassau, and I think the band was having some internal problems at the time. There were a few drink issues going on. This was the album that Phil Rudd, the drummer, was fired on and eventually replaced by Simon Wright. But I think his drum tracks do remain on this album. It certainly sounds like it. There's a real kind of back to basics, punky, simple approach on this record. There's nothing fancy, not that there ever is with AC/DC, but relatively for them, there's nothing fancy. That's reflected in the cover, which is a sort of simple pencil drawing. I do like this album. It's got a nice dry sound to it. Guns for Hire, the title track, Bedlam in Belgium. I mean, I quite enjoy these songs. And again, it's a really solid AC/DC album without being really, really good. Number 9, For Those About to Rock from 1981. This was the follow-up to the enormous Back in Black album, so expectations were huge. It was produced by Mutt Lange again, who we'll talk about a little bit later. This has the saving grace of the title track, which is an absolutely killer song. It also the other single was the very subtle "Let's Get It Up," but a lot of these songs are chorus and riff by numbers. The supporting cast of songs here isn't that great, but this album is salvaged by fantastic sound, because if anybody could ever make AC/DC sound great, it was Mutt Lange. And the title track is a killer. It's an AC/DC staple to this day in their live songs, live sets. Number 8 from 1995, Ballbreaker. Well, Phil Rudd is back on drums, hallelujah, and you can really hear it because there is just that fantastic pounding away backbone with Cliff Williams on bass, holding everything down. This album was produced by Rick Rubin. He had a very eclectic way of producing. By all accounts, he would lie around in the studio with all kinds of substances to help him soak up the music, and he would just listen all day long, and then he'd hear something and make the band play it again, and then they'd develop it. I think the band found this very sort of it took a long time, and it was quite tedious, and I'm not sure they're that happy with the sound of the album. I love it. It's really dry, it's really punchy. There's some really good songs on here. Ballbreaker I really like, Burning Alive, and there's a sense of fun. There's Hell Caesar, Cover You in Oil. I mean, none of it's very subtle, but there's some good choruses on here, and I think this is a good record. From number 7, Stiff Upper Lip from 2000. Produced by Big Brother George Young. It sounds really good. It's recorded at Bryan Adams' studio in Vancouver. Again, it sounds dry, but unlike Ballbreaker, which had preceded it, it has a bit of a sort of more modern sheen on top. I think they were much happier with this. This has got some really good songs again. Stiff Upper Lip, Satellite Blues, Safe in New York City. They were all the 3 singles, but all the other songs on here are pretty good as well. You get the sense that the band is really beginning to, I don't want to say care again, but I just think they're beginning to get their mojo back, for want of a better phrase. I think it's a very solid AC/DC record, and I put this one on quite a lot. Number 6 is from 1976, and this is our first Bon Scott album, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. Produced by George Young with Harry Vanda. Bon Scott was a better lyricist than Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson was all about the double entendre. Bon Scott had many more strings to his bow lyrically, and he was something of a kind of rough and ready street poet. He could be very witty and very funny. It could be very cheeky. He could be very charming, and that was also came across in the delivery of his songs. So you've got a song like "Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap," which is great fun. I mean, he's no less subtle. I mean, there's a song called "Big Bulls" on here, which is just one big enormous innuendo, but it's great. There are some really good riffs on here. Mark Evans is on bass. Cliff Williams hasn't come in yet. Interestingly enough, this is the 3rd highest selling AC/DC album in the US after Back in Black and Highway to Hell. So number 5 is High Voltage from 1976. This was a mashup of 2 albums released in Australia, High Voltage and TNT, which were then brought together and released internationally. So that's the one we're looking at today. Again, Mark Evans on bass. But this is their first album. Every track on here is a killer riff and a killer chorus. And you've got that formula straight out of the box with the backbone of the bass and the drums. You've got Malcolm Young's fantastic rhythm guitar, Angus's, of course, dynamic lead, bluesy playing on top, and Bon Scott with that cheeky chappy, slightly dangerous delivery. TNT, High Voltage, the Jack, it's all there. And then you've got, that little nod to their Scottish roots with the bagpipes on It's a Long Way to the Top If You Want to Rock and Roll. They never took themselves too seriously, AC/DC. Their tongue was always very, very firmly in their cheek. But this is a great AC/DC record, I think. Number 4 from 1979, Highway to Hell. This was the first album to be produced by Mutt Lange from Zambia. He'd cut his teeth doing pop rock bands like the Boomtown Rats and Graham Parker, and he comes in and he takes a lot more time with the drums, setting up the drums. He takes a lot more time recording and making sure the guitars are in tune, so everything is just a little bit more professional. This is a great record. This is a very popular AC/DC record, not least because of the iconic title track, Highway to Hell, which is a song played all across the world incorrectly by budding guitarists every night. The song is synonymous with the band, but there are lots of other good songs on here. Shot Down in Flames, Touch Too Much, If You Want Blood, You've Got It. It's a really, really good AC/DC album. Number 3 from 1977, Let There Be Rock. This is raw and punky, and you can hear the guitars spilling over. For some reason, I think there was some kind of a backs to the wall attitude when they recorded this album, because they'd taken some stuff to Atlantic, their record label, and I think Atlantic had not been happy with it and rejected it a little bit. So I think AC/DC thought, okay, well, we're going to show them what we can do. So there's a real sense of anger, and this is probably AC/DC's most dynamic album. The riffs absolutely just crash out of the speakers when you listen to them, and they're great riffs. You've got Go Down, Problem Child, Hell Ain't a Bad Place to Be, and Whole Lotta Rosie, of course, which is an absolutely AC/DC standard, which they still play in their sets today, one of the most popular songs. It's ferocious. The playing is ferocious, and there's like a siege mentality from the band. You know, we're going to show Atlantic what we can do, and I think this is often a hugely underrated AC/DC album. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Number 2 from 1980, Back in Black, the monstrous Back in Black, selling over 20 million copies, often regarded as one of the best hard rock albums ever made. This album simply sounds incredible. Mutt Lange got it absolutely right with this record. It's one of the best sounding hard rock albums you will ever hear. Now, by this stage, Bon Scott had died and Brian Johnson had come in. He played in a band called Geordie, and he had a very different kind of vocal delivery. He had the unenviable task of having to lyrically complete the songs they'd already written, intending Bon Scott to sing. You've got Hell's Bells, Shoot to Thrill, You Shook Me All Night Long, another iconic AC/DC title track, Back in Black. You've got another very subtle song, Let Me Put My Love Into You. I mean, these songs are all part of the hard rock Bible. They are absolutely great rock songs. They sound fantastic, and Back in Black completely deserves its place at the top of so many all-time best rock albums. And it's probably the first album you might send somebody to go and listen to if they wanted to get into AC/DC. But my number 1 AC/DC album is from 1978, and it's Powerage. This is an album that's that for a long time sort of fell between the stools of Back in Black and Highway to Hell. But I think it's been reevaluated a lot over the last 15 years, particularly by AC/DC fans, and it's now regarded absolutely as one of their very best, if not their best. Mark Evans is out by this point, so Cliff Williams is in, so you've got the classic AC/DC lineup: Phil Rudd on drums, Cliff Williams on bass, the Young Brothers, and Bon Scott. And it seems a funny thing to say about AC/DC, but this is their most intelligent album, and I don't mean that disparagingly. But the songs do seem to have a little bit more to them. That street poet thing about Bon Scott that I was talking about earlier is most evident on this record when you're listening to What's Next to the Moon, Down Payment Blues, Cold Hearted Man. I think it's also their bluesiest album. They're not necessarily bluesy 12-bar songs, but you come away with that vibe about them. You've got Rock and Roll Damnation, which is one of their poppiest songs that opens the album. They wrote that specifically as a single because the record company said this album doesn't have a single. It doesn't need a single, although Rock and Roll Damnation is a very pleasant way for this album to open. Then you've got Sin City and Riff Raff, two absolutely brilliant AC/DC performances. Riff Raff particularly, which is just one fantastic riff after another, woven together to create this monstrous song which just explodes out of the speakers and sounds brilliant. So like I said, it's been reevaluated reevaluated a lot over the years, Powerage, and I think now a lot of people in the know, as it were, regard Powerage as absolutely one of their best albums, certainly right up there with Back in Black. It's my favourite. I personally prefer the Bon Scott albums. I think the Brian Johnson years were much more inconsistent and much patchier, and I think the Bon Scott albums were very, very consistent indeed. So that is my list of AC/DC albums. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you don't agree. If not, please say so in the comments below, and I will see you again very soon for another Rock Records Reviewed. Thank you. Bye bye.